"I can't pay for it," the old man said, and he held the door half open as if he hadn't decided yet whether he was coming in or going back out into the rain. Iris Harmon had been behind the counter for 11 years, first as her aunt's helper, then as the person keeping the whole thing from sliding into the harbour, and she knew that particular voice. The voice of a man whose coat was good once and wasn't anymore. The voice of someone who had spent a long time being the kind of person who paid for things. "I didn't ask you for money," she said. "Sit down before you let all the heat out." He came in. The door swung shut behind him, and the October rain drummed on the roof of the little diner that her Aunt Delphine had left her 3 years back, along with the mortgage, the walk-in freezer that ran warm, and a name over the door, the Headland, that Iris had always thought was either poetic or just an old Cape Breton woman's idea of a joke. She'd never managed to decide which. The old man settled onto the end stool, the one nearest the window, and he set his bag on the floor between his feet and put his hands flat on the counter. His hands were what you noticed first. Long-fingered, steady, the nails dark blue-black at the edges in a way that no amount of scrubbing would fix. Not grease, ink, the permanent kind that a person accumulates over decades of the same careful work. She poured coffee without asking, because that was the one thing she'd learned from Delphine that she'd kept without modification. "You pour the coffee first. Everything else can wait." He wrapped both hands around the mug like it was the most important thing he'd held in some time. "Cecil Uldren," he said. "Iris, Harmon, this is my place." She cracked 2 eggs onto the flat top without looking at them. "And I've got half a pound of home fries I made too many of an hour ago, which means they're either yours or they go in the compost, so you'd be doing me a kindness." "That's a very generous lie," he said. "It's a very practical one. There's a difference." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face, and then it passed. He looked back out the window at the rain coming off the harbour in grey curtains, and she let him. A man like that you didn't crowd. She built the plate full. Eggs, home fries, 3 rashers because the package was open, toast gone properly dark the way it should be, a wedge of the blueberry buckle she'd made yesterday because the summer berries were still holding at the farm stand and she'd had a good morning. When she set it in front of him, the plate rang against the formica. Cecil Uldren looked at the food for a long moment. Then he ate slowly, careful, deliberate bites, fork set down between each one, and Iris understood it the same way she'd understood her aunt, who had been a proud woman right up until the end. The slowness was not about savoring. It was about keeping something intact. The last private thing a hungry man owns is the ability to not look hungry. She refilled his coffee and pretended to organize the sugar caddies, which were perfectly organized already. "You draw maps," she said, because she'd seen the calluses along the side of his right hand and the ink that went too deep into the knuckle creases. He looked at his hands as though he'd nearly forgotten them. "I charted things for 40 years, the coastline, mostly. Inlets, shoals, things that shift." "Shift how?" "Slowly." He lifted his coffee. "But they shift. That's the whole problem with maps. They tell you where something was, not always where it is." She didn't entirely understand that. She filed it away. When he was done, he folded his napkin and set it precisely on the emptied plate. He reached into his coat and produced a worn leather coin purse, opened it and looked at what was inside for a long time. Iris watched his face do the arithmetic that Delphine had done at this same counter, more times than Iris wanted to count, and she leaned across and set her hand gently over his. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "You can tell me what those hands of yours used to chart." He looked up at her. His eyes were pale grey, quick, and considerably more alert than the rest of him. "You'll put yourself out of business," he said. "I'm doing that on my own just fine. Come back tomorrow." He came back. The second day he ate without speaking much, but he looked around the diner with those quick eyes, the way a person looks at a place they're trying to memorize. The third day, he asked if she had paper, and she gave him the back of a placemat and a pencil from the order cup, and he turned on his stool and began to draw. What came out from under that pencil in under 20 minutes was the Cape Breton coastline, as she had never seen it rendered. Not photographed, not printed, but mapped with a kind of careful love that turned the familiar headland and the rocks below into something almost unbearably specific. He drew the inlet she'd driven past 1,000 times. He drew the spit of land only visible at low tide. He drew a house she didn't recognize, set back from the shore on a rise, pale and low, with a long porch and a stand of birch trees to the north. When she set his plate down, she looked at the drawing. "What's that house?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "A place I used to be permitted to go," he said. "It's been a while." She didn't push, she filed that away too. The town had opinions, of course. Towns this size always did. And the headland sat at the bend, where the main road turned toward the ferry terminal, which meant everyone passed it, and half of them slowed down. By the fourth day, Iris had heard secondhand that she was running a charity, that Delphine would be appalled, that Cecil's Uldren hadn't been seen around town in years, and here he was taking free meals off a young woman who could barely make her own mortgage. She set a clean plate in front of Cecil and said, "I hear I'm going broke feeding you." He looked at her carefully. "Are you?" "Not any faster than usual. Eat your eggs." It was the fifth day when the other kind of trouble walked in. Young, wearing a suit that had no business being on the Cape in October, the collar too tight, the shoes impractical for the wet. He had a branded folder under his arm, and the kind of smile that lived entirely in the front portion of the face and went no deeper. "Mrs. Harmon." He set a business card on the counter. "Ross Langford, Crestline Properties. I'll be quick, since I can see you're managing the lunch hour." His eyes moved to Cecil, to the placemat drawings stacked at the end of the stool, to the half-empty diner. "We've been in contact with your landlord. The building's gone up for tender. You may have received something in the mail." "I receive all kinds of things in the mail," Iris said. "The offer has changed since our last approach. It's come down." The smile didn't flicker. That tends to happen when a commercial property falls behind on its lease. 2 more missed payments, and the landlord has options that don't require your agreement. "We're prepared to offer you enough to clear your arrears and walk away clean, which is considerably more than you'd walk away with in a default proceeding." He set the folder on the counter. "We'd like to move quickly. There's a development proposal for this block that's been in planning for some time." Iris looked at the folder. She thought about the $380 she'd counted out of the till on Thursday, which was the whole of it. "Get your folder off my counter," she said. The smile rearranged itself into something less pleasant underneath. "Mrs. Harmon, I understand this feels. I understand what it feels like, perfectly well." She came around from behind the counter the way Delphine had taught her, using her full height, which wasn't considerable but was pointed. "You've come into my place with a number you've already decided on, and a face designed to look like you're doing me a favor. Take your folder and go." Langford went, but at the door he stopped, and when he turned, the face had given up its project entirely. 60 days, Miss Harmon," he said. "After that, whatever sentiment you're holding on to here becomes someone else's square footage." The bell above the door, and he was gone. The diner went very quiet. Cecil had set down his fork. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something troubled in it, and something underneath the trouble that was almost like a decision being made. 60 days, he said. "Give or take, don't start." "I was only going to say," he said, "that it's a very good diner." She laughed, which surprised her. "That's the first thing you've said I haven't had to argue with." He smiled then, a real one, not the ghost of one, and it moved into his eyes and took 10 years off his thin face. He left that afternoon before the evening regulars arrived. She was washing mugs when she went to clear his stool and found his coin purse sitting on the counter where his plate had been. It was open. The coins were gone. In their place was a small folded piece of paper, and resting on top of it, the pencil stub she'd lent him 3 days ago. On the paper, in the careful cartographer's hand, she was beginning to know. "For safekeeping. There is a door this opens. You'll find it if you go north." And underneath the pencil stub was a key, brass, heavy, old. The kind that belonged to a house that had been standing long enough to have opinions about it. He did not come back the next day or the day after. On the third day, without Cecil Uldren, a car came down the main road moving with the particular unhurried authority of money, and parked in front of the headland's window. A woman got out. Silver-haired, carrying a briefcase that suggested she had never in her life run late for anything. The bell above the door. Miss Harmon." The woman's voice had been trained to move a room without being raised. "My name is Rowena Fisk. I'm a solicitor. I've been retained by the estate of Cecil Uldren." Iris's hand went still on the dish towel. "Estate." "Mr. Uldren is very much alive," Miss Fisk said, and something at the corner of her mouth might have been amusement. "He is at this moment on a train to Montreal, which is consistent with his general preference for being somewhere that cannot be argued with. I've learned to draft quickly." She set the briefcase on the counter and opened it. "I'm here as a courtesy. Legally, the matter is already concluded." She laid a document folder on the counter, considerably thicker than the one Ross Langford had left. 4 days ago, Mr. Uldren executed a transfer of title. It has been signed, witnessed, and registered. There is nothing outstanding and nothing further required of you." Miss Fisk looked up, and her eyes on Iris were precise and not unkind. "As of this week, Miss Harmon, you are the sole registered owner of Uldren Point, the main house, the outbuildings, the map archive, and 14 acres of coastal land on the headland north of here. It was appraised conservatively at $1.3 million. The freezer hummed. Through the window, the afternoon ferry horn sounded, low and regular, the way it had sounded every afternoon Iris had spent in this building. "That's not. People don't just." "Mr. Uldren does," Miss Fisk said. "Once before in 30 years. I advised against it then as well." She reached into the briefcase and brought out an envelope, cream stock heavy, Iris's name on the front in that precise ink-stained hand. "He asked me to give you this after you'd been told the number. He was very specific about the order." Iris's fingers were not quite steady. "One other thing." Miss Fisk's voice did not change, but something in it became more careful. "Mr. Uldren has a grandson, Tobias. He manages what remains of the family's business interests, and he did not know his grandfather intended this. I informed him this morning." She clicked the briefcase shut. "He is not a man who absorbs surprises gracefully. He'll be here by late afternoon." She left, and Iris stood in her diner with a deed on the counter and an envelope in her hand and the old brass key already warm from her pocket, and she broke the seal. The letter was short. "Iris, by the time you read this, I'll be somewhere you can't hand the key back. That's deliberate. You fed a stranger 6 days without once making him feel the weight of it. I have known a great many people with considerably more to spare who never managed that. I watched the man from Crestline come in and leave, and I watched you afterward, and I know what's in the register and what's on the lease, because I grew up in this town and some things don't change. I am too old and too tired to watch a good woman lose a good place to a bad number. The house is mine to give. You are the first person in a long while I have believed deserved something without hedging. Don't thank me. This is not a gift, it is a correction. The map archive is at the end of the porch walk, North Light. Go and look at it. There are things in it that belong to you in ways I cannot adequately explain in a letter. Leave the door unlocked, you'll understand why, CA." She read it twice. The second time, she caught on things that belonged to you and couldn't move past it. She should have waited. She knew that later. But Iris Harmon had spent 3 years being told by careful men in sensible shoes what she could not afford, what was not reasonable, what was already decided. And the particular stubbornness that had kept the headland open through 2 hard winters and a burst pipe in February had never once taken well to sitting still. She flipped the sign. She got her coat. She drove north on the coast road with the letter and the brass key on the seat beside her. The turn for Uldren Point was marked by 2 stone gateposts so overgrown with lichen they were nearly the same color as the birch trees behind them. The lane beyond curved up through long grass, gone copper in the November light, and then the house appeared over the rise, and Iris took her foot off the accelerator without meaning to. It was exactly the house from the placemat drawing. Pale grey fieldstone, low and long, the porch running the full length of the south face, 2 chimneys gone dark with weather. The birch stand to the north, old and enormous, taller than the house, the headland, dropping away behind it toward the sea which lay flat and gunmetal in the late afternoon. Starlings turned over the eastern chimney in a loose murmuring wheel. She had driven past the turnoff 100 times in her life and never once come up this lane. The front door had a new deadbolt, bright and incongruous against the old wood. The key in her pocket was not for it. She stood with the useless key in her hand and read the letter again. The map archive is at the end of the porch walk. North Light. Leave the door unlocked. The porch walk ran around the north side of the house through a garden that had gone magnificently to its own devices. Rose canes climbing the stone wall, last season yarrow gone silver, the smell of wet earth and cedar. At the end of it, low and long, attached to the house by a covered breezeway, was a room with a north-facing glass wall gone slightly green with age. A lamp was burning inside. She had told no one she was coming. Cecil Uldren was on a train to Montreal, and yet a light was on in a room she had been told to find, and someone had left it burning as though they'd expected to need it. She heard at that moment the particular sound of expensive tires on gravel, fast, coming up the lane she had just left. She looked at the lit window. She looked back toward the sound of the engine. She walked toward the light. The door to the map archive opened on a long wooden groan, and the smell reached her first, linseed and old paper, tongue oil and the dry sweetness of drawings left to age undisturbed. The smell, she would think later, of a person's entire working life concentrated into one low room. The lamp burned on a trestle table at the far end. Standing beside it, one hand resting flat on a rolled map as though quieting a restless thing, was a woman, old, small, square set, wearing a cardigan the color of river clay. White hair pinned back with severity. Black eyes in a face that had been outdoors in maritime weather for 7 decades, and had the map lines to prove it. She didn't startle. She turned her head and looked at Iris the way you look at weather you've been tracking all week. "You took the porch walk," she said. "He said you would." "Who are you?" "Odile Vachon." She said it the way someone else might state coordinates. "I've kept this property 35 years. Longer than you've been on this coast by the look of you." Her eyes moved down and back up. "You've got flour on your sleeve." Iris looked. "She did. I was baking this morning." "He said you would be." Odile's mouth did something complicated at one corner. "He telephoned from Truro. Reversed the charges. If you can believe a man who gives away a house won't spend the money on a proper call," said a woman named Iris Harmon would come up the porch walk alone, because he'd told the grandson to meet her at the front door. That's the surest way to make her not come through the front. Outside, gravel crunched, an engine cut. "Someone's coming," Iris said. "The grandson." Odile didn't move. "Tobias Uldren. He'll try the front, find the new lock, come around." Her black eyes held Iris steadily. "There's something you need to see before he gets here. He was particular about the order. First you alone, then whatever comes after." She nodded toward the far wall. "Come look." Iris didn't want to cross the room. Every sensible nerve in her wanted to turn around and drive back to the diner and wait for the solicitor to tell her what to do. But she had walked toward the lit window once already tonight, and she found her feet carrying her down the length of the archive, past flat files stacked to the ceiling, past rolled survey tubes in labeled racks, past instruments in leather cases, until she stood before the north wall in the lamplight. And the north wall was a woman. Not one drawing, dozens. The whole long wall was hung frame to frame with hand-drawn maps, floor to ceiling, and every map was centered on the same cove, the same small house sitting above the waterline with its back to the trees, rendered in different seasons, different tides, different lights. The cove in summer with the water going green and shallow over the rocks, in winter with ice along the shore, at dusk with the lights of a small building reflected in still water, and in each one, in the foreground or at the margin or tucked beside the house, a figure, small, always in motion, drawn in a few economical lines that nonetheless made her unmistakable. Wide stance, dark hair, hands always occupied with something. Iris's throat closed. She knew those hands. She had watched those hands ice a birthday cake when she was 7, and gut a fish when she was 12, and sign papers in a hospital room 4 years ago, with a dignity that had made the nurses step back. She couldn't finish it. "Delphine Doucet," Odile said, and her voice had gone quiet. Though she was Delphine Doucet when he mapped her first, before the family had their say. The room tilted. Iris put her hand on the edge of the flat file and held on. "That's my aunt," she said. "My Aunt Delphine. She left me the diner. Her voice broke and reassembled. She never mentioned him, not once. She used to say the Cape Breton coast was companion enough. She said it had never once asked where she'd been." "No," Odile said. "She wouldn't have spoken of him. Too proud, same as him. That's what finished them. 2 people too stubborn to be seen wanting something they weren't supposed to have." A door hinge shrieked somewhere in the house. "What happened?" Iris asked. Odile was quiet for a moment. Then she decided something, and her voice went careful and coastal and precise. Cecil Uldren was the family's one son who cared about maps instead of money, in a family whose money came from fishing licenses and land tenure along this coast. He met your aunt the summer he was 28, when she was waitressing at a place 2 kilometers south of here that isn't even a foundation anymore. They had a year and a half. Her voice caught on the words and went on. His mother found out he meant to marry a girl who carried plates and lived in a rented room, and she did what families like that do. She didn't shout, she arranged. Delphine's father had a fishing license that came up for renewal before the provincial board, the same board the Uldrens had sat on for 3 decades. A word in the right ear, and the renewal was denied. The Doucet family lost the boat, lost the house that went with it, scattered up the coast, looking for whatever work they could find. Iris's eyes had filled, she let them. And he let it happen. He was told, Odile said steadily, that if he continued the association, the license would be denied permanently, for any Doucet, any generation, so he did what his family required of him. He married the woman they'd chosen. And he was permitted, the word arrived with a taste she clearly disliked, to go on mapping the coast. And every map he made for 40 years put her cove at the center of it. Boots on the porch walk. Iris barely heard them. She was looking at a winter map, the cove grey and cold, the small house with its single lit window, and in the foreground, barely there, a figure standing at the shore looking out, and you could tell from those few lines alone that she was not looking at the water. She was looking past it. He came to the diner, Iris said slowly. He came looking for her. He came looking for her place, Odile said. He's been ill since last winter, his heart. When he came out the far side of it, the one thing he wanted before the city was to see where she'd ended up, because she used to write him in the early years before even that was stopped. She told him about a diner she'd taken over. She told him it sat on the harbour bend and the coffee was strong, and the sign outside was a good one. Odile stopped. He drove down, and the sign was there, and the woman behind the counter had Delphine's hands and was feeding a stranger out of an almost empty till. And I think for one moment he thought he'd walked back into his own past. A pause. Then he realized he hadn't, and he stayed anyway. The archive door opened behind them. Tobias Uldren was younger than Iris had braced for, early 30s, compact, wearing the kind of expensive casual clothing that required money to look unstudied. He had his grandfather's pale grey eyes and none of his patience. He stood in the doorway and looked at the north wall, the map of a woman's life rendered in 41 coastal charts, and whatever he had come prepared to say did not come. "Who," he said carefully, "is that?" No one answered. He came into the room slowly. He stopped in front of a summer map, the cove in full light, the figure on the shore laughing at something just off the edge of the paper. He stared at it for a long time. "There are dozens of her," he said. 41, Odile said, "without mercy, the way you set a bone. Delphine Doucet, later Harmon. This woman's aunt, the woman your family ensured your grandfather didn't marry." Something moved across Tobias Uldren's face that Iris hadn't expected. Not anger, not calculation. Something more stripped down than either of those. "He used to bring me here when I was small," he said. "To this room. He told me the maps were his best work. He wouldn't let anyone else in." He looked at the archive around them, the packed shelves, the careful organization of 40 years. "I thought it was vanity. I thought he just didn't want anyone touching his things." He looked back at the wall. He had this in here the whole time. He had her in here. He kept what he was permitted to keep, Iris said, and she was surprised by the quietness of her own voice. The maps were his. She was in them. It was the only door they'd left open to him. Tobias turned and looked at her fully for the first time, his grandfather's eyes quick and pale and suddenly very tired. "He gave you a property worth more than everything else we still own combined," he said. "You understand I have to contest it. There are people, staff, a foundation that hasn't been properly funded in 6 years, a research archive my grandfather has been personally subsidizing. When he signed over this land, he didn't just give you a house. He took the pin out of everything that's still standing and boarded a train." A pause. "Name a number. Whatever you need to clear the diner's arrears and get yourself somewhere stable. I'll have it transferred by Friday." She looked at him. She looked at the wall behind him. 41 maps of a cove, 41 renderings of a woman who had gone to her grave, believing she had been too much trouble for love to afford. "No," she said. Tobias went still. "He didn't give me a house," she said. "He gave me the proof of something. I'm not selling the proof." She reached into her coat pocket and set the brass key on the flat file between them. "He said the archive contained things that belong to me in ways he couldn't explain in a letter. I'd like to know what those are before anyone tells me what they're worth." Tobias looked at the key. Something crossed his face, not quite recognition, but its close relative. "There's a cabinet," he said slowly. "At the back, he never let me near it. Even when I was sorting the estate for the accountants, he said it was cartographic records and none of my business." He looked up. "The key I have doesn't fit it." Odile reached under the trestle table and drew out a flat wooden case, long, map-width, fitted with old brass hasps and a new padlock that matched the key in Iris's hand. She set it across her forearms and held it out. "He was specific," Odile said. "Her hands first, then the rest." Iris picked up the key. Her hands were steady, the same way they went steady when the morning rush hit, and the oven and the espresso machine and the till all needed attention at once, when there was simply no available room for being afraid. She fitted the key to the lock. It opened with the ease of a mechanism built right, a spring released after long patience. On top was a survey map, larger than the framed ones unrolled, held flat by its own age. It was the Cape Breton eastern shoreline, the entire headland survey, rendered in a detail so precise that Iris could see the depth soundings marked in the cove, the wetland hatching along the shore north of Uldren Point, the careful notation in the bottom corner, Protected Coastal Wetland, Federal Register, File 1987 CB. Tobias leaned in and read it. He went very still. "That's the parcel," he said quietly. "That's the exact parcel Crestline has been trying to rezone." "The wetland designation," Iris said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was looking at. "A federal wetland designation on that parcel makes it unbuildable. Crestline's application claims the coastal survey from 1994 shows no designation. It's been the basis of their rezoning proposal for 2 years." He looked at the date on the map. "This survey predates theirs by 7 years. "He kept it," Iris said. "He kept it because someone needed him to produce it, and he told them it had been destroyed in a storage flood." His jaw worked. "He told me the same thing. I asked about the coastal files 18 months ago, when Crestline first approached us. He said the original survey records from that period were gone." Odil's voice came from the side of the room, very dry. "He lied to your face and told me afterward that some things were too important to be found by someone who might sell them to the wrong buyer." Under the survey map, the case was full. Correspondence, applications, hearing minutes, notes in Cecil Uldren's careful hand dating back 15 years, a meticulous record of every approach Crestline Properties had made to the estate, every offer, every indirect pressure, every name. And at the bottom, in a separate envelope, a document Iris almost missed. Clipped to it a piece of paper in the now familiar hand. "This one is not about the land." Inside was a letter, old handwritten on paper gone soft at the folds, dated 33 years ago. It was from Delphine Doucette Harmon, to a man whose address was this house. "I'm writing because I have decided to stop being angry and start being practical, which I think you might recognize as the most difficult thing I've ever attempted. I don't forgive them, and I won't pretend to, but I forgive you, because I think you were trying to protect something that didn't ask to be protected that way, and I was too proud at the time to see it, and I have wasted enough good years being too proud. I found a diner. It's a good one. The coffee is strong and the sign outside is painted by someone who liked birds. I am going to make it worth something. I think you should know that I am going to be fine. I think you should also know that I still think you were wrong. D." Iris read it twice. The second time she stopped at "I am going to be fine" and couldn't move past it. She had inherited a diner from a woman who had written, "I am going to be fine" to the man who broke her heart, and meant it, and spent the next 30 years making it true. She had always known Delphine was stubborn. She had not known, until this moment, the size of what the stubbornness had been built around. She was crying quietly. She didn't try to stop. Tobias said nothing. He stood at the edge of the lamplight and looked at the maps, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its transactional quality entirely. "I grew up in that house," he said, "and I never once thought he was happy. I thought he was just very contained. I thought that was what he was. I thought that was what we all were." A pause. He had 40 years of her on these walls and all of this in the box, and he was still contained. He shook his head slowly. "He gave you the house because you had her hands, and you were doing the reckless, generous thing he couldn't protect her from being punished for. And he gave you the proof because you were the right person to be found, holding it when Crestline came looking. He turned to look at her. He did all of it in about a week. He was efficient," Iris said, and her voice came out unsteady, "for a man who spent 40 years on the same map." Tobias almost smiled. It arrived and left before it properly landed, but she'd seen the shape of it. "The survey records," he said. "If they're authentic, and they look authentic, Crestline's rezoning application collapses. The protected designation holds. The headland cannot be developed as steadily. You'd need someone who knows the provincial land process." "Do you?" A long look. "I've been fighting that process for 18 months. From the wrong side of it, yes." She looked at the archive around them. 41 maps, 35 years of careful stewardship, a locked case full of evidence one old man had held onto for over a decade, waiting for the right moment to put it in the right hands. "The foundation," she said, "the one that hasn't been properly funded, what does it do?" "Coastal heritage research, oral histories, environmental documentation. It was his life's work outside the surveys. It's been running on residual grants and my personal transfers for 6 years, and it is 6 months from closing. He said it the way you state a budget figure you have already grieved." "And the archive." She gestured at the room, the flat files, the careful cataloguing, 4 decades of coastal documentation. Is any of this publicly accessible? None of it. He never allowed it. She looked at the map on the table, at the letter, at 41 renderings of a woman who had been declared too inconvenient for love and had spent 3 decades running a diner and being stubbornly fine. It should be, she said. All of it. The maps, the survey records, the oral history documentation. A proper archive, publicly accessible, with the Doucette name in the provenance as it should have been from the beginning. She looked at him steadily. That's what this is worth, not a number, that. Tobias looked at her for a long time. The property contest, he said at last. I was going to file Monday. Are you still? Something moved in his grandfather's pale eyes. Not warmth exactly, but the place warmth might eventually reach. If we file the survey records in the correct registry before Crestline's hearing date, he said instead of answering, their rezoning application gets withdrawn. They lose the headland. They lose the entire development proposal. 14 protected acres sitting in the middle of their map like a stone they can't move. He paused. Langford won't lose a project this size gracefully. He'll come at you directly. I've had men with folders tell me what I can't afford before, Iris said. I found it's mostly a statement about them. This time, the almost smile made it all the way. She kept the letter. She kept the small map that Odile pressed into her hands before she left, a folded one, which turned out to be the cove in late summer, the figure on the shore rendered in more detail than usual, laughing at something just past the edge of the paper. On the back, in ink gone brown with age, Org. 7, she laughed at the tide table. Said it was optimistic, she was right. She drove back down the coast road with the lights coming on over the harbour, and the ferry horn sounding its low, reliable note, and she thought about a woman who had written, I am going to be fine, and made herself right through sheer Cape Breton stubbornness, and she had to pull over for a moment near the turnoff and just sit with it, the size of the love and the size of the waste of it, before she could see clearly enough to drive. The survey records were filed the following Tuesday. Crestline's rezoning application was withdrawn before the month was out. Ross Langford relocated his operations to another county and did not return. Some losses, Tobias told her later with the precise equanimity of a man reporting weather conditions, are absorbed differently when the person on the other side isn't scrambling. They had expected her to be scrambling. She hadn't been. The archive opened to the public the following spring, properly catalogued, with a reading room built into the east wing of the house where the north light came in clean and good. The Doucette Uldren Coastal Archive. The sign on the door read, and the first time Iris saw it there, she had to go inside quickly and be very busy with something for a while. The foundation was refunded through a provincial heritage grant and a private donation whose origin Tobias declined to publicize, on the grounds that generosity, he had recently been informed, was not an advertisement. He was right. She told him so standing in the porch walk in March, when the last of the winter had let go enough for the yarrow to start coming back, and he had driven up from the city with the grant documents and stayed to help her move a bookcase, which was not what the documents required, but which she suspected was precisely the point. It was slow. He had told her it would be, and he was in this particular thing a man of precision. There was a first walk along the headland in April, the sea still grey and cold, the birches just starting to turn. A conversation about his grandfather that lasted 2 hours and ended in the archive with him, sitting on the floor with the summer maps spread around him, learning 41 versions of a woman he had never known to look for. A phone call in May at 11 at night that started as a question about a survey notation and became something else entirely by midnight. He drove up the coast road on a Saturday in June without a stated reason. He stayed for dinner and helped close up the diner afterward, because she still opened 3 days a week, and she still left a plate at the end of the counter at the quiet hour between lunch and the evening ferry. Just a plate, a full coffee cup beside it, for whoever needed it, because that, she had decided, was not something a house or a legal victory or a properly funded foundation changed. That was the thing her aunt had spent 3 decades doing in a diner on a harbour bend, for reasons that had turned out to be larger than anyone standing in that diner had known at the time. She kept the headland, she kept it open, and she kept the sign, which someone repainted by the time spring came. A proper headland this time. The stone and the water and the particular quality of the light, very good, by someone who knew this coast. Letters came from Montreal that winter and the next spring in the careful cartographer's hand. No salutation, just Iris, and they were full of complaints about the museum there and the damp in his hotel room, and a disagreement he was conducting with a framer over the matting on a survey print. He never once thanked her or let her thank him, and she understood why. This was the nearest a man like that could come to being happy out loud. She wrote back on the backs of order tickets because it made him write longer in return. In one letter near the end of the second spring, under his standard complaints about the framer, there was a single line she cut out and kept in the coin purse where the brass key had once been. You set a plate down for a foolish old man who told you he couldn't pay. It turned out the plate was the whole of it. It was always the plate, Iris. Keep feeding strangers. It is the only reckless thing that has ever once paid. She did. She kept the headland open on the harbour bend, sign whole and bird bright, and she stood behind the counter 3 days a week long, after there was any earthly reason to. And when someone came in at the dead gold hour between lunch and the evening ferry, and looked at the display case first, and then looked away, ashamed of themselves, she would have a plate on the flat top before they'd finished deciding to be too proud. No charge. It would only go in the compost otherwise, and she'd stand there feeling wasteful. It was a very practical lie. She had learned it from the most stubborn woman she had ever known, and she passed it on to the man she loved. And she intended to keep telling it to strangers on the coast road until she couldn't lift a pan. Because it turned out the old cartographer had been right about the one thing that mattered, the thing that had been true all along in a diner, on a harbour bend and in 41 maps of a laughing woman at the edge of the sea. It was the plate. It was only ever the plate. If this story settled something in you tonight, if you believe, the way Iris did, that a plate set down without condition is sometimes the bravest thing a person ever does, and that the quiet, stubborn, generous hearts are never as small as the world decides they are, then stay a while. Subscribe and keep listening. The underestimated are never as small as the world believes, and the kindness offered without expecting anything back always finds its way home. Thank you for being here. Sleep well.